Welcome to Nerdword. Alright, so on Nerdword we are going to be checking out the history of prostitution. Yeah, that's what we said. History of prostitution. We're going it. Let's get into it. No, we're not getting into the biblical references because we're looking at actual contextual history. For the record, today's subject...
Chocolate.
Is that today's subject?
No, prostitution.
Oh. Could you imagine chocolate prostitution? That'd be great. But instead we're talking about prostitution, so therefore...
Not.
And in prostitution you...
Not.
And then you get more...
Not.
And then there's...
Not.
For now, let's just go into some history, shall we? So back in the days of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, prostitution actually wasn't seen as a bad thing. Both men and women did engage in prostitution, and sometimes the women that were engaging into the prostitution were actually extremely influential and affluent women. And there were such things as religious prostitution in these time eras. You were known as a Corinth, and you served the gods essentially by being a prostitute. Crazy fact. Now I know what you're thinking.
Bruh.
You would like to have been a sacred prostitute as well. I mean, you're serving a higher purpose by being a prostitute and you get money for it? Who wouldn't? Now I know what you're thinking. At this point, well, why wasn't everybody a prostitute? Because it served their god. Therefore, everyone should have just been chilling in the porn zone. No. See, sometimes it was actually a punishment. When you were punished by being a sacred prostitute, it was because you were being punished for being an adulterer in real life. So you've cheated on your significant other. So therefore, now you must serve God with your bits.
This is Sparta!
So between ancient Egypt and Rome, straight through to about the Middle Ages, the only thing that changes is Constantine, the Roman emperor who made Catholicism the religion of Rome. He starts removing sacred prostitution as a thing and starts dismantling brothels in general because that's against the Christian religion and the new Roman Catholic Church. So, I mean, after Constantine comes in, it's not a good time to be a prostitute. You've got nowhere to work, you've got nowhere to go, and you've got no temples to run out of. Therefore, you're on the streets. Could it get any worse? Yes. Because now you're about to enter the Middle Ages. Now, by the Middle Ages, makeup is kind of more of a mainstream thing, so prostitutes are no longer allowed fancy things, like in the Roman and ancient times, you were allowed fancy things. Fancy dress, makeup, food. Now you're not allowed any of those things. Your entire establishment has been all but crumbled? Would be the best word for it. It's unfortunate, but I mean, at this time, it's the height of the religious peaks. And the height of the religious wars. Usually, at this time, most towns wouldn't even let prostitutes operate within city limits. You actually had to find your own brothel outside of town, or your own shack outside of town, in order to work your trade, more or less. Which now puts a damper. How are you supposed to market to your clients if you can't even interact with your clients? In London, on the other hand, the brothels of South Wark were owned by the Bishop of Winchester. After this, it became common in major towns and cities of southern Europe to establish civic brothels. So essentially, it was just a street or a small section of town that was established specifically for prostitution. This is where the prostitutes were to operate in. They were not allowed to leave this area for business purposes. And essentially all of their trade was done inside of here. Whether they were trading food, whether they were getting supplies, they basically had a town inside a town. But yet, more bad news was to come, even after the Middle Ages. What bad news could that be? Well, the plague came back. And when the plague came back, it came back with other plagues known as syphilis and chlamydia. Terrible. Unfortunately, because of these sexually transmitted diseases during this time frame, this is where prostitution starts to take a downturn. It is no longer seen as any form of profession anyone should have. It is furthermore outlawing brothels and prostitution and to strengthen it as something that was criminal. This act in itself did put a lot of people out into destitution. There wasn't a lot of jobs for single women back in those days, especially if you didn't have a husband.
What if you're gay?
Good point. What if you were gay? Well, this is where it gets even more fun. Usually you had to have yourself a little shill husband, a fake husband, more or less, to make children with. If you didn't, you were a spinster. You could live your whole life alone, but if you were to hook up with another woman, so to speak, it wasn't illegal to sleep with her, but it was illegal to attempt to get married. For some reason in the Bible, it was man on man that was considered actually illegal. Woman on woman wasn't considered illegal until a little bit later in time. Partly because a lot of kings used to utilize it for their own benefit, we'll say. Craziest little part? You're a prostitute? You want to repent? Too bad. You're not allowed in church. Seriously.
What the fuck?
So much for wanting to change your lifestyle. But, inevitably, the church tried to say it was a lesser evil over time, meaning that they weren't going to fight prostitution as much as they had bigger fish to fry. At the same time, they weren't going to encourage it either. They had a stance, it was called their threefold rule: the acceptance of prostitution as an inevitable social fact, the condemnation for those profiting from this commerce, and the encouragement for the prostitute to repent. So, I mean, you get two choices. Repent and make no money and go destitute. Don't repent, make money, and be a social pariah. What are you gonna do? Now, all that's fine. The Protestant Reformation happens. It's the 17th century and a lot of things start crashing down. Martin Luther happens. King Henry VIII changes the church and creates the Church of England in, England. The problem with all of it is they tried to shut down all of the brothels again. It didn't really work, so instead they came up with new rules that the prostitutes actually had to distinguish themselves in public by wearing veils, having no hair, very short hair, and ancient codes regulated the crimes of prostitutes that dissimulated her profession. These are the rules from 16th to 17th century. Now we get to roll into the 18th century. Dun da da da. It's gonna be absolutely, yeah. So what ends up happening in the 18th century is we're going to take a little jump out of Europe and go over to the Turkish Empire, because this is where they're kind of infamous in this time frame, because this is the era of the Turkish bath. The Turkish bath didn't actually have women in it. The sex workers there were young men who would soap and wash down the clients, scrubbing their bodies completely. And when we mean completely, we mean...
It's over 9,000!
Yeah, the whole 9 yards. Now, these sex workers that worked in the Ottoman baths, they actually had a bunch of text about them written. They described their prices, who they were, how many times they could bring their customer to, well, the end of a glorious, glorious time, you know? Yeah, that kind of happy ending. Another thing that happened in the 18th century, they're presuming it was in Venice. We don't actually have any evidence beyond this. Prostitutes started using condoms. They were made from animal insides. But they worked, and they helped the stop to spread disease. Imagine that. Prostitutes been using condoms since 1700, but y'all still... Okay, I get it. I'll stop. And this brings us to within the last 200-ish years. So now we're into the 1800s or 19th century. In the 1800s, prostitution is now seen as a necessary evil, an aid in marital fidelity, apparently, especially as the system that would allow men to obtain sex when their wives did not desire it. What a great system, isn't it? Oh no, my camera almost fell. That would have sucked. In 1830, finally, you're walking the streets as a prostitute. Great time. You could still be arrested, but you're less likely to. If you worked in a brothel, no raids ever happened. Well, if not none, next to none. It's not that there was none, they just tried to avoid them if they could. Comparatively rare, and prostitution was tolerated in mining towns especially, because miners were lonely men who worked long hours, who just need a little loving too, guys. Now, in 1875, though, essentially the first human trafficking laws in the U.S. happen, where they make it illegal for the importation of women for the purpose of prostitution. The nation move to criminalize prostitution was led to a Protestant middle-class men and women who participated in the revivalism movement of the 19th century. So essentially they were looking for a redo of the Catholic removal or the Protestant Reformation that happens in the 18th, 19th century. They're looking for essentially a clean Christian way of living.
Fuck off!
Yeah, that's what most people were saying. Because a lot of them understood that prostitution wasn't going anywhere and you couldn't force it to. Now, mining camps are kind of the best part for prostitution. If you were a prostitute in a mining camp, you probably made great money because you were making the money off of the miners, and quite a bit of it. And every mining camp actually did have their own prostitution house, more or less. They actually became worldwide famous, especially in the 19th century when long-distance imports of prostitutes became really common, even though they were kind of illegal. Great times. Love the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, more or less, women are running this business. It is madams that run the brothels, it is women that are in charge of them, and men just come to use them. Nothing more, nothing less, for the most part. There are still a few male-run brothels out in the world during this time frame, but not that many. You'd actually be in shock to know that most of these things were run by women for women to work in. Ha. So guess what? Now we're in the 20th century. So like 100 years ago. So.
It's not prostitution, it's a way of life now.
Well, that's the 21st century. We're still in the 20th.
Oh.
100 years behind. 100 years behind. But it is a way of life now. Anyway. So, World War I. In colonial Philippines, U.S. Armed Forces develops prostitute management program called the American Plan. Go U.S., said no one ever. Which enabled the military to arrest any woman within 5 miles of a military cantonment if found infected. So if you were trying to infect American GIs with your syphilis and your stank, guess what, sister? You lose. Because you were going to be arrested, you were going to be fined, and you were going to be charged. Because it was highly illegal. And in 1921, the International Convention for the Suppression of Trafficking Women and Children was signed. Which means that now we're seriously supposed to, importing people across the world for the purpose of sex trade working. During World War II, on the other hand, things get a little wonky. World War II, Japanese soldiers engaged in forced prostitution, where they would take Chinese, Korean, many people from across East Asia and Southern East Asia, and force them into prostitution for their military. This has put a severe damper on the relationship between China and Japan for a lot of time between now and then. A lot of people still remember this, and they're still really, really hurt about it. we'll get into that in a different video altogether in a later episode. That's a different kind of topic. But for now, let's just stick to the actual prostitution facts. Sex tourism, yes, you heard that right. Sex tourism. That's a thing. It emerged in the late 20th century as a controversial aspect of Western tourism and globalization. Sex tourism was typically undertaken internationally by tourists from wealthier countries. So you, as a rich white guy from Minnesota, would be traveling to Africa to tour their prostitutes. And why not? You had the money to do it. You had the money to pay them. The only thing that could happen was you bring back syphilis, gonorrhea, or AIDS. Leading theorist of communism opposed prostitution, though. Karl Marx thought of it as only a specific expression of general prostitution of the laborer. See, most of them didn't agree with it, and Vladimir Lenin found sex work distasteful. Surprising, seeing as Stalin doesn't care so much. Yeah, especially, yeah. As a whole, for the 20th century, communism does oppose prostitution. Karl Marx thinks of it as nothing but an expression of general prostitution of the laborer, and Vladimir Lenin found sex work distasteful. The communist government often took wide-range steps to repress prostitution immediately after obtaining power, although the practice would always persist because it is the longest-running and strongest-going industry in the entire world, and is the longest-running trade. Now, before the end of the 1900s or the 20th century, a legal approach to prostitution actually does emerge. At the end of the 20th century, termed the Swedish model, this included the prohibition of buying but not selling of sexual services. That means that only the client's commits a crime in engaging in paid sex. The actual worker, on the other hand, is not committing a crime. She is within her legal rights, or his legal rights, dependency on who they are, to sell their body, but it's the person who's giving them the money that's actually against the law. Now, these laws are being considered in other jurisdictions, and these laws are attempted to protect the worker and embrace the fallout of sexual revolution. Nifty. Meaning, sex will happen. Obviously, you exist, don't you? The only thing the government's asking for is for you to be respectful, and there must be free-form regulation. In other words, there still has to be rules. You can't just shank your prostitute when you buy her, or else you're not going to have a prostitute, because she's going to die and you're going to go to jail. So, now that we're going to jump from the 20th century right into the 21st century, we've legalized it to a degree. Sex workers have more rights than their clients, finally. And now, the best part of all, we're in the 21st century. In the 21st century, since the break of the Soviet Union, a whole bunch of people have decided that they voluntarily would like to be a prostitute because you do make really good money. In Europe and Asia, working as a prostitute in Dubai, men from Saudi Arabia and United Arab States form a large portion of the consumers. So, that brings us up till now. The only other neat fact, it's not really neat, but in India they brought back sacred prostitution. Girls from very poor families are forced by their family to dedicate themselves to the Hindu goddess Renkua, and essentially be a sanctified prostitute. So we're heading back to ancient Greece in more modern times with bringing back official sanctified or sacred prostitutes. That's it. That's all for today. We've officially covered from ancient Greece until modern times in the history of prostitution. I hope you enjoyed, and next episode will probably not be on prostitution, guys. Sorry, this is probably one of the only full prostitution videos. I think we did enough. We've covered it all. There's nothing else to tell you. There's nothing else to...
Shut up!
And that's where we end. Bye, guys. See you next time on Nerdword.